Hey, hi everyone. Just want to confirm that the meeting is open and everyone's in the room.
Yes.
Great, great. Thanks everyone for joining us. Just want to remind, or at least let everyone know that we have a highly interactive, at least beginning portion of the session. So before we get started, if you have your smartphones around, I encourage you to scan the QR code on the screen, and you can take part in some of the fun things that we have lined up. But otherwise, a warm welcome to everyone. Um, so. Welcome to Climate Finance for Water and Sanitation. What does it take? So this is a One for All session. Welcome, everyone. So One for All, for those of you who don't know, is an alliance of organizations that's led by IRC, Water for People, and Water for Good, and it's dedicated to championing collaborative methods to support water and sanitation and hygiene issues across the world. We work with local, regional, and national governments to implement climate resilient systems strengthening. And all of the members here in this session, or all of the participants here in this session, come from one of our One for All Alliance members. So yes, we're very proud to share this session and the wisdom of our panelists with you today. Before we get started, I will do some standard housekeeping, digital housekeeping. Again, for those who have just joined, please join the Mentimeter scanning the QR code right there so that you can enjoy all the interactive features that we have lined up. As far as I understand, you might already be muted and your video is off, but there will be a portion after the panel discussion during which we will allow you, or it will be open to everyone to be able to pose their questions in person or by turning on their videos and microphones to be able to ask your questions yourself to the room and to the panelists. So briefly, I had mentioned the One for All Alliance. I am Dayton Dalrymple. I am a Communications and Influencing Manager here at IRC, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session and to the wonderful discussion that we have lined up. Briefly, what to expect. I will be passing over shortly to my colleague Shaini Saha, who will be giving you a brief context and introduction to the topic of climate finance from the perspective of water and sanitation and hygiene. Then we will have a 35-minute panel discussion featuring Water for People. And then we'll have some Q&As from the audience members, and then we'll conclude with a closure. And with that, I will jump straight to the main course. Shaini, would you like to take over and give us an introduction to the topic?
Thank you, Dejan. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are. As Dejan mentioned, we have a very interactive session planned for you. So next slide, please, Dejan. If you could scan and join us on Mentimeter to answer this question. Should we be talking about WASH in climate finance? Yes, as expected, we have 16 people who have already voted. And yes, this question seems like a no-brainer for experts in this room. We should be talking about WASH and climate finance, but it's also important to address why is it important to talk about WASH and climate finance. Next slide, please, Steve. Yes. We know that 90% of natural disasters are water related, and water and sanitation play a very important role in both adaptation and mitigation strategies of climate. For instance, replacing this energy source to renewable sources of energy for pumping and purification of water, that is like a mitigation strategy. And building climate resilient WASH infrastructure is a climate adaptation strategy. Next slide, please. The next question that arises is, but are we addressing WASH in climate finance? And if so, how much of climate finance really addresses WASH? If I could request everyone to go back to Menti and answer this question. Yes, the correct answer is currently less than 5% of climate finance is being dedicated to address water and sanitation in climate finance. If we could go to the next slide, please. If we could have a look at the graph here, currently there is too little climate finance, and even less of it is tackling the water sanitation crisis, which is currently at only 3%. This graph is from the Climate Policy Initiative. It says that up to 2023, we had spent about 2,000 US billion dollars on climate finance, whereas the requirement is somewhere around 11,000, 12,000 US billion dollars. And of that very little pie, 3% is only going on water and sanitation. Next slide, please. Then the question is, are we unable to mobilize funds if required? We see that where we have only 1.3 US dollars, trillion dollars on global climate finance flows, there is 2.2 US dollars being spent on global public expenditure in military, and we see 7 trillion US dollars on fossil fuel subsidies, whereas the requirement for global climate finance is about 8.6 trillion. And from COVID-19 emergency, we saw that we could mobilize around 11.7 trillion US dollars. So if required, we are able to mobilize funds. It's just that the world has competing priorities and is not prioritizing climate finance currently. The next question that this brings to our mind is, where is this climate finance for WASH generally flowing to? If I could request you all to join us again on Menti. Yes, majority of the wash flows in climate finance is towards adaptation strategies. If we could go to the next slide. We can see from this very complicated Sankey diagram that while mitigation strategies dominate climate finance, um, there is only a fraction of it is on adaptation, and water and waste comprises majority of adaptation. Adaptation is usually considered localized action on climate resilience, and despite it being very urgent. Go to the next slide, please. Yes, so what is this these adaptation measures are usually on building climate resilient infrastructure, but we know that right now we need a systems perspective to address climate change and wash in climate change. And it has to go beyond capital expenditure on data and policy implementation on governance to address the problems of too much water, too little water, and polluted water. But currently it's focusing heavily on infrastructure building. Next slide, please. So this is our last Menti question. To which part of the world is most of the climate finance directed to? So yes, despite it being an urgent need for countries in vulnerable regions, a very little of funds are reaching those who need it the most. If we could go to the next slide, T. Yes, like if we have a look at this map, we see it's concentrated primarily in China, Western Europe, bit in North America and South America. And if you look at the graph below, over from 2016 to 2020, the composition of climate finance dedicated to low-income countries is pretty low compared to that in low middle-income countries and upper middle-income countries. So it's 3% of global climate finance, which flows to the least developed countries currently, which need it the most. With that, thank you everyone for joining us. I have tried to set the scene. Now I would like to hand over to Lisa Rivera from Water for People to take us to the next session.
Oh, thank you so much, Shiny. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, everyone. I'm Lisa Rivera, and I am working for the regional office in Latin America at Water for People. And I have the pleasure to moderate this panel today. So I just wanted to highlight the very interesting data that Shiny just shared with us about different aspects of climate finance. So now I want to invite the audience to a deeper discussion into the topic of climate finance, but through a different perspectives. We will see the perspective of finance, then the perspective of national impact and social justice perspective. So let me introduce our panelists for today's session. First, I have the pleasure of introducing Ruby Novello. Ruby Novello is the Water for People Global Advisor of Equity and Inclusion, and she will share the perspective of social justice and inclusion. Welcome, Ruby. As we want this to become this conversation to be very grounded conversation and very specific cases, we have today the interesting country perspective from Brenda Hachiro, Country Director of Water for People Uganda. Welcome, Brenda. And finally, for the finance perspective, I invite Paniso Kalua. He is the Senior WASH Advisor for the Africa region at Water for People. Welcome, Paniso. Before starting, I wanted to remind us that we can send, we will have a space after this panel for a Q&A, and also you can send your comments, your reflections as we flow with the panel now. So thank you so much for that. So let's start with Paniso, following the line of the good introduction of Shiny. Paniso, when we talk about the gaps on climate finance, maybe we are not just meaning about there is not enough climate finance, but we can distinguish different gaps. Paniso, could you specify on these different gaps and how could they be addressed? Thanks,
Thank you,
Paniso.
Risa. Thank you, Risa. And thank you so much for having me on this panel. Just to indicate that I work at the regional office, working with colleagues in Malawi, in Rwanda, in Tanzania, as well as in Uganda. So my perspectives are actually shaped by the experiences from these countries and what I observe in Africa as a whole. So indeed, from the presentation, you'll see that we have much less climate finance. And just to make sure that I re-emphasize that when we talk of climate finance, it's actually broader, much broader than just the climate funds. So we have some climate funds that are accessible, but we also have the private corporations and we have several sources. However, the gap is so huge. It's not just the amount of the finances that we countries or stakeholders can access. Beginning with, I think for what we have observed over the years, is the institutional setup. So you will see that a lot of the climate finance sources, they target governments, they target either national or local governments. And what they would like to see is that there are proper governance structures in place. Maybe the most fundamental, the basic, is to make sure that every country has a national designated authority. And this authority is the one which makes recommendations in terms of which institutions can receive climate funds, maybe as national implementing entities. So you are really looking at the engine of a country that is supposed to lead in terms of the overall coordination. Related to that, we've seen also the basic gaps in terms of accreditation. So for most of the institutions, you need accredited entities, but you realize that some of the sector ministries maybe responsible for water and sanitation are actually not accredited. In many instances, they rely on the regional, maybe accredited entities like the UN, which is okay, but it does point out to significant institutional gaps in a particular country. We've also seen gaps in terms of general knowledge. So you'll see that for us as a sector, in terms of water and sanitation, the beginning point to access the climate finance is to make sure that the water and sanitation is reflected as a major issue in terms of our nationally determined contributions, the national adaptation plans. But in some cases, you find that we don't know, or we have come up with those, the NDCs, we have the NAPs that are not really prioritizing WASH as one of the issues that require to be addressed. So I see that as one of the gaps, basic gaps. So when you look at all these things, you actually see that our environment may not be ready for climate finance until we do certain things. So we need an enabling environment for us to be able to access the climate finance. When you look at the various countries, you will also see coordination gaps between WASH as a sector and the other sectors, even other ministries. In some cases, you find that the people in the water sector, they do not talk to people that are in environment or that are in health or that are in agriculture. Or you will see climate finance actually coming into countries through maybe several funds. They're doing well maybe in agriculture, but you will see that there is no proper component in terms of water or in terms of sanitation. So we see that as one of the major coordination gap because it is also possible to access that. Aside from the public sources, we have private corporations. And when you look at the private corporations, their mode of operation is slightly different from the public institutions, but they will also look at certain basic things. So for example, do we have environmental and social assessments? Do we have these safeguards in place? What risks are available in a particular country, whether it's political, regulatory, even maybe currency risks, right? So the private corporation are looking at still at the environment. And you'll see that as a sector, we are missing out, not just because the little climate finance is there, but even the little that is there, we have challenges in terms of accessing those. Maybe for now, I can stop there, but there are more that I can actually add and add. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Paniso, and very glad that I'm seeing that there's several questions now, so we will get back to the panelists later. So thank you, Paniso. I want to highlight two things. One is the enabling environment. We need to have the enabling environment just to have the capacity to access climate finance. And the number two that I want to highlight is coordination gaps, because might seem very simple, coordinating in country, different ministries, different sectors, for example, but might not be so easy to do. So thank you, Paniso. I'm going to Brenda with some specific perspective from Uganda. Brenda is our country director of the Water for People Uganda. Brenda, could you share how Uganda has been successful in securing climate finance? Is there a specific strategy to connect WASH in the country climate finance strategy? Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you, Lisa. I would like to start by stating some facts that in Uganda, our climate finance need is approximately 28.1 billion US dollars that we need to implement our updated nationally determined contribution. And we expect the government of Uganda to cover about 15% of those costs. Uganda has been successful, well, not very successful, but at least we have registered some success with tapping into climate finance from international support, from the likes of United Nations Development Program, World Bank, and other organizations. Actually, the World Bank has a portfolio of 3.9 billion US dollars in Uganda for financing credits and grants. We have also gotten into the space of carbon markets. Uganda has established a national task force on climate change mechanisms to develop modalities for carbon tracking. And then, of course, also the green industrial finance. The Bank of Uganda has set a policy rate of 10.25% to control inflation. And among the initiatives that this should support are the Green Industrial Finance Facility to support climate-friendly projects. So with a bit of that background, I'm glad to say one of the key success stories has been actually that we've invested a lot in creating that enabling environment to make us both fundable and findable. And I think Paniso mentioned the enabling environment is very critical. Our third and fourth national development plan provides for a full program on environment and natural resources, climate change, water management, and land management. We do have a green growth development strategy that is running up to 2030, and it's meant to operationalize the tenets of a green economy. We have a national climate change policy that was developed in 2019, aimed at establishing and operationalizing a comprehensive framework. We also have a national climate finance strategy. So when it comes to creating an enabling environment, I'm glad to say I think that is one of the areas that the country has invested in so much to place itself to be able to tap into climate financing. Uganda has also been very active in the Conference of Parties meetings or the COP meetings. I know COP 30 is coming up. we have been active participants, sending very good representation of experts to be part of the negotiations happening. And before and after every COP session, there is a task force that has been established that deliberates, works out what are the priorities as a country, what should we negotiate for before COP, and then after COP, there are also, post priorities or post action. So we take the conference of parties meetings very, very importantly. It has put us into the space to find some of the donors. We, as a country, have also invested a lot in preparation of fundable proposals. We are not yet there, but at least some of the proposals we've been able to prepare have enabled us to tap, for example, into the adaptation fund and the green climate funding windows. As I speak, we've been able to get 4 projects funded. I mean, as a country, there was a just ended Eureka project that was 7.7 million US dollars. There's another called Dresser that was 13 million US dollars. Slam Dunk, 0.5 million US dollars. Curfew, 10 million US dollars, all funded under the adaptation fund. And we have currently a 24 million US dollars from the Green Climate Fund. So as a country, we've been able to tap into this, and I must say there's been, lessons learned. How do you prepare yourself? Have you understood the language? Do you know the priorities? Most of them, you have to target most vulnerable areas. You need to articulate your social and economic benefits. So those have been some of the strategies that have led to the success in the country. And yeah, we've been able to unlock quite an amount for climate financing. But we keep learning each day, every day. We've set the task forces. We have a climate financing unit in the Ministry of Finance. We have a climate finance department in the Ministry of Water that coordinates all that. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Great examples and great specific aspects that you highlighted. And I would like to mention, having the enable environment in place. You mentioned several policies in country coordination aspects and being fundable and findable. And in the last one, you highlighted being findable also means to be active in those global settings, global scenarios, to be findable by donors. So thank you so much, Brenda. So I will go with another perspective from Ruby. Ruby, we have seen in the introduction some specific data on the role of debts on countries suffering the most, how climate finance and social justice are related. Thank you, Ruby.
Great, thank you, Lisa. So first, I want to start by acknowledging that it is encouraging that social justice is increasingly being discussed within climate change and climate finance spaces more than before. And we know that countries who contribute the least to climate change are suffering the most from climate change, which is making it challenging for them to cope with, recover from, and adapt from climate-related extremes. And we also know that in these countries, the existing water supply and sanitation systems are more vulnerable to climate impacts. At the same time, we know that the majority of climate financing flows directly to contributing countries, which, as we saw in the introduction, are often high income. At the local and national levels, we also need to pay attention to the fact that subsidies and investment flows frequently favor wealthier households and corporate actors, as opposed to vulnerable communities and fragile ecosystems. Again, as we saw in the introduction by Shiny, it's clear that the current mechanisms of climate finance are unjust, with only 3% of global climate finance being directed to lower income nations. On top of this, and importantly, climate institutions have differing and complicated eligibility criteria that burden and limit the institutions applying for resources. So when thinking about inclusion, financing is inaccessible for non-governmental institutions such as civil society organizations, especially those who are representing the people being most affected by climate change, such as organizations of persons with disabilities. And these smaller organizations are often ineligible, or the application process to receive these funds, the processes are too difficult or burdensome. We also know that climate change is disproportionately affecting historically marginalized groups, such as Indigenous communities who are particularly vulnerable to climate impacts. And this is making it an issue of social justice. These socioeconomic and environmental disparities are one of the major causes of deep-rooted barriers faced by marginalized communities. So climate justice requires that we not only understand these inequalities and barriers, but more importantly, that we take specific steps to eliminate them. So at Water for People, we're working on climate resilience at a systems level, making us aware that one of the biggest barriers to closing the coverage gap relates to financial flows at the global, national, and local levels. We know that there are challenges with the amount of money allocated for WASH and with the utilization of these resources. And when we add the perspective of climate change, we see the similar challenges linked specifically to injustices. So in Peru, one of the countries where we work, the diverse geography makes it especially vulnerable to climate change, where each region is facing distinct hazards such as glacial retreat, prolonged droughts, and floods. So we're partnering with the local government in the district of Asuncion for integrating climate resilience into district-wide WASH systems. And there's been an emphasis on the importance of blending traditional knowledge with modern systems thinking, strengthening local capacity, and institutionalizing resilience through policy and financing. So this has demonstrated that even small rural districts can and should be leading on climate adaptation. However, some of the biggest lessons that we're learning are that persistent challenges remain around financing, institutional fragmentation, and ensuring gender and social inclusion. So when we're thinking about why inclusion is key to climate resilience, again, we know that local communities who are already experiencing pre-existing vulnerabilities that worsen during climate impacts, such as more frequent and intense disasters, they're the ones already leading in contextualized and sustainable solutions. We also know that vulnerability to climate change increases when individuals face intersecting forms of multiple discrimination, such as disability, gender, ethnicity, and age. So by adopting an intersectional and inclusive approach and understanding the barriers experienced by marginalized individuals and groups, we can make progress towards climate resilience. We also know that climate change has a greater impact on women and girls than men. On average, women and girls in lower income nations walk 6 kilometers per day to fetch water. And due to climate change impacts and decreased reliability of water resources, such as from drought and flooding, this task is becoming much more difficult and dangerous. And this includes an increased rate of gender-based violence. So the impact of this is even greater on women and girls with disabilities. Inclusion also means integrating indigenous and local knowledge, which is crucial for climate resilience. Many indigenous traditional practices offer effective nature-based climate solutions, such as sustainable agricultural systems and climate-resilient water management. So it's crucial to recognize that indigenous people are experts in innovations and practices that have been passed down through generations and have allowed different cultures and communities to live sustainably with a deep understanding of and respect for ecological systems. And just as importantly, we cannot talk about inclusion without focusing on persons with disabilities, who represent the world's largest minority group with about 1.3 billion people globally. They are the experts in the barriers and facilitators they face daily in accessing WASH services, which are being impacted by climate change. So including persons with diverse disabilities, not just physical, In all climate finance advocacy and decision-making will ensure that the solutions and resources are accessible and include critical budget lines for reasonable accommodation. And these factors taken together will directly impact climate resilience. And then my final point is to work towards climate resilience, we must ensure that key stakeholders from civil society, especially from marginalized groups such as women, youth, and persons with disabilities, older populations, and indigenous peoples, we must participate meaningfully in decision-making, implementation, and oversight. And this participation must be inclusive, accessible, and sustained. Thank you,
thank
Lisa.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ruby. And want to highlight two key messages from you. Is one was about combining ancestry, local experience with innovations for climate, and to be like more grounded initiatives for climate finance. And the other one that I wanted to highlight is that you share an example that even a district or local area could be leading on climate resilience. So it's not just like a maybe global or national vision, but locally led adaptation means that actually that we can be leading from the local areas. So thank you so much, Ruby. We have several questions here, so I will start with some questions. I will combine the question here, which is about the number one question. Can you little explain which country or organization who are financing more for climate finance? But I also have a question here about do you appreciate that there seems to be a multiplicity of agencies involved in climate finance? So maybe we can combine both questions. So I will start with Paniso, and please Brenda or Ruby can add to the response of this question. Who is financing more in this spectrum of climate finance? Thank you.
Thank you, Riza. Thank you. So to respond to that, because I know there is a temptation to many partners and stakeholders to find a silver bullet solution to climate finance, which is actually not the case. So what we have is that we have several sources of climate finance, actually beginning with the international climate funds, like the Green Climate Fund. We have the Adaptation Fund. These are very specific, very huge, but the good part or the beauty with these is that they accept proposals on a rolling basis, right? Then we have specific options, like in Africa, we have the African Development Fund, which actually provides the climate action window. It's a very specific window. They have been releasing calls. At some point, it was just focusing on adaptation proposals, then mitigation proposals, but that's also one of the definite sources of climate funds. Apart from that, we do find several bilateral donors coming on board. So like recently, we were dealing with a call from the Danish government, that's the Danida, right? So they will also have some aspects of the climate finance. Now, to combine this maybe with some of the questions, what we need to appreciate as stakeholders is that there is no issue that you can say, this is water and here is the climate finance donor. It all depends on what we call the climate rationale. So you can justify almost any issue, whether it is on-site sanitation, whether you are dealing with sewers, but all these things will depend on the science. What's the science? What's the climate science, which we call the rationale? Very important. And the other important term that we all need to understand is the issue of additionality. So we know we are used in terms of the water and sanitation sector to write our proposals in a specific way. How do we justify that the issues that we want to address are really climate change related issues? When you address those issues, you will find that many calls which come out there, either they come on a regular basis or the ones that you may need to probe and talk to certain donors, whether they're individual donors, they will always base their issue on what is the climate science, what risk assessment have you done? So these are the core aspects of any proposal in the sector that we should be looking at in terms of addressing. For me, I say we need to be prepared. Once we are prepared, we will be able to see the various sources that are out there. I know also there was a question related to loans. Yes, we know that most of the public institutions, particularly the international public institutions, they prefer loans rather than grants. And in some cases, we talk of the blended nature, where you have got a small component as a grant, but maybe you need to have a repayable type of loan. There are lots of opportunities, but firstly, let's get the basics right. Let's make sure that we have worked on things that can help us to qualify once we see an opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Panisa. I will switch to Brenda for another question that we recently take. This is, thank you for the great presentation. I heard you mention that an enabling environment is crucial for watching climate efforts. Could you clarify what kind of enabling environment is most needed in a national context? Have you undertaken any related activities, and could you share a concrete example of the type of actions required to strengthen this enabling environment? So Brenda, please share with us the experience from your country perspective. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Lisa. Yes, so when we say having an enabling environment, it's about having all structures, policies, institutions in place to be able to tap into climate finance. There are some principles I think that most climate financiers look at. First of all, it has to be nationally requested for. Documents like the nationally determined contributions are key. That is what is looked at. Priorities are picked from nationally determined contributions of every country, because it's part of, you know, a global UN framework. If you're going to be financed, you're also expected as a country to have institutions that will coordinate and sustain the climate the climate priorities or implementation. So having a dedicated department, like I mentioned, in the Ministry of Water, there's a dedicated department. Having units like the climate finance unit in the Ministry of Finance there, and having a task force that leads the way in coordinating this is critical. My colleague Paniso mentioned earlier that there's also need to have a national implementing entity. And in this case, the Ministry of Water and Environment is accredited for that. So you have to have all those pieces in order, have the policies, the structures, the institutions in place to show your readiness to be able to attract and implement climate finance projects. The other specific action I can talk about is we've been part of a task force that have supported in developing of the HNAP. We call it the HNAP, that is the Health National Adaptation Plans of the Ministry of Water and Environment, of the Ministry of Health. Currently, we are also part of a task force that is developing the WASH National Adaptation Plans. Again, these are mechanisms that are expected to be in place if you attract this financing. So when it comes to understanding what specific actions, it's actions such as that. Convene, let there be discussion happening. Another action is you support to have national vulnerability and risk assessments. conducted, because you're expected to develop projects that are need-based, that are focusing on the very poor, that have both social and environmental benefits. So you need to have assessments done, vulnerability and risk assessments in place. Currently, as Water for People in particular, we're already supporting now at district level, because interventions have been done at national level to have these assessments. We are continuing further at the lower level or at the district level to carry out vulnerability assessments and develop district-specific adaptation plans. We call them district climate action plans, sorry. So when you have all those things in place, it's easy, like I said, to attract funding, because you have to have the relevant documentation in place. So those are some of the interventions you can conduct.
Thank you so much, Brenda. We have some more questions here, but we will go with another round of final round with the panel to finish with the looking to the future. So I'm going with you, Ruby. Can you share in 2 minutes what are your final reflections for the future on how to address the challenges in your perspective of climate justice and inclusion? Thank you, Ruby.
Great, thanks, Lisa. So when we're looking at social justice, we first must remember that individuals and communities are crucial for resilience, and power structures must be changed through the rights-based approach, and meaningful participation of individuals from marginalized groups must be guaranteed in how all investment decisions are made. And by taking this rights-based approach, individuals are entitled to enforceable rights and they're active participants. This will help influence decisions around community priorities, promote inclusion, and the realization of rights of all excluded individuals, while also strengthening accountability. We also must further integrate Indigenous and local knowledge into eligibility criteria for funding and resources, and make these resources available not just to governments, but directly to civil society as well. Next, governments, WASH, and climate change stakeholders should implement the principles for locally led adaptation. This will support the necessary shift from the current top-down approaches to local actors, who will gain power and resources to build resilience to climate change. And then, as I mentioned before, we know that all impacts of climate change are felt at a local level. Therefore, we know community-led adaptation is essential. Communities experiencing these climate risks can clearly explain the issues and propose the best adaptations. And finally, and most importantly, the voices of women and girls, persons with disabilities, Indigenous peoples, and other populations most vulnerable to climate change must be at the center of the work by prioritizing diverse knowledge systems to inform these context-specific and sustainable solutions. Meaningful participation of civil society supports the necessary and crucial inclusive governance processes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruby. So I'm going with Paniso. Paniso, what are your final reflections to the future? What is your advice with all these experience and backgrounds that you have shared with us? Thank you, Paniso.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I do think that the climate finance is actually the future. And the water and sanitation as a sector, we have a lot of work to do, but it is actually promising that we can increase financing. Actually, it's a source that we should be looking at in terms of tapping in the current scenario, where we know that the development aid is actually not improving. So this is a good way to look at. My advice to all partners is, let's scan around in terms of these climate financing options. We know we have some partners or some organizations that are accessing different forms of climate finance. For example, we know a number of NGOs that are accessing the carbon market as a source. Right, so that's also one form of climate finance. The issue is that we need to be prepared, be ready, but also scan around to see who is offering what. For example, I mentioned the climate action window. It comes and it goes. We have the adaptation fund. The window is almost always open, but when you check, because they're very transparent in terms of they show the countries that have submitted the proposals, at what stage they are. You realize that other countries are not submitting any proposals. So unless you go through this learning journey, you cannot know which are the sources that are out there. As Water for People, we also learned quite a number of things as we have been struggling, but we have seen that one of the things that we need to do is to partner with either the national government or the local governments, because most of the financing sources, they require a government entity to be part of the solution because you are dealing with the communities which are managed by these governments. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Paniso. Going with Brenda Hachiro, our country director from Uganda. Thank you, Brenda, for all your practical example from the successes from Uganda. What is your reflection for the future, Brenda, just with Uganda, and also your advice for other countries that want to access climate finance? Thank you, Brenda.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. One of my reflections is the need for stakeholders to invest in understanding climate resilience, climate finance, the principles around climate change. It's an emerging subject. It is new. There's a lot of information, but sometimes it can be ambiguous. So it's important to invest in learning and understanding everything to do with climate change, climate resilience, climate finance, understand the language so that when the opportunity presents itself, you know exactly what you're going for. And again, I'll repeat, being fundable and findable, we need to be able to invest in project development. We need to be able to invest in that so that we are found to be ready. And of course, also just to emphasize that the private sector has a role to play. We are talking about innovative financing mechanisms, blended finance, you know, where we have space for private sector, for financing, for financial institutions to come into this space. It is quite a virgin space, and there's space for all the stakeholders. So an encouragement to the private sector to get into it as well.
Thank you so much, Brendan. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you so much. And thank you for the interaction of the audience. So we will try to answer the remaining questions by chat, or maybe there's another way to answer the questions. So over to Deacon to some final takeaways and reflections and closure. Thank you so much.
Hello.
Yes. So thanks so much to our brilliant panelists for their insightful contributions. It's been really a treat to have everyone share their collective wisdom on this topic. So we hope everyone has learned something new and that you're inspired to take some of the recommendations shared by the panelists to build a fairer, more resilient world. At this point, we are quite biased. We are at World Water Week, but it's quite obvious that the climate crisis is indeed a water crisis. But it's now about our collective responsibility to ensure that water is also at the core of climate resilient discussions and climate resilient solutions. So climate finance is not a charity. It's an investment in our futures. As Penny so nicely said, it's the future. And I would say it's the present. Development cannot be development without climate resilience. Resilience is climate resilience. And we know very well that the cost of inaction far, far outweighs the climate finance needs. So despite that, there's still much more to be done. But thanks to our panelists for sharing their wisdom, we hope that we can incrementally close that gap. And we are starting to see some positive developments. As Brenda mentioned, filling the knowledge gaps is a core part of doing that. So now over to a shameless IRC plug. So at IRC, we wear many hats. And so I'm also speaking to you on behalf of the Wash Systems Academy. And I'm proud to use this moment to briefly introduce our free online learning platform. And I promise it's relevant because we had mentioned that this is a one-for-all session. One for All has collaborated to create several courses on climate resilient wash. So through the Academy, we hope to unlock people's potential to lead systems change by connecting them to inspirational people, ideas, and knowledge. And we try to make these more complex issues more digestible, more fun, more interactive, and connecting you to a community of people who feel the same. So we have an 8-hour climate resilient wash services course, which is also available in French and Spanish. But we also have a shorter bite-sized 1.5-hour course on climate resilience, the basics. And for those of you who want to dive in deeper on climate finance, we have a slightly more in-depth course, and a lot of the content that's been featured in this session features in the course and has additional rich material and resources for you to dive into, and that is a 1.5-hour course. So that's not the only thing that we offer. I mean, as we know, water touches on so many issues. So in addition to climate finance, I welcome you to take all of our systems strengthening courses, our advocacy courses. There's something for everyone, and we hope that you interact with us and that we can see you in that space soon. And for those who are interested, I will share this QR code for you to use your mobile phones to scan and to register. With that, I think we're running short on time. I thank you deeply for your participation and for all your questions. It's been a really interactive session. So thank you so much for sharing all of this, all your comments and your insightful words. So thank you. And I wish everyone a happy World Water Week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. I will close this meeting now.
Thanks.
Goodbye.
Bye.